Hello, class. So we're going to talk about managing finances. And this will be the beginning of a section we're going to talk about at length. So what is financial management? That's the science and practice of managing money or other assets. And in order to manage money, you have to have a lot of self-discipline and control, which is something we are not good at. You got to have the ability to set goals and the willingness to put future needs before current needs, and also to understand the difference between needs versus wants. So the financial management model looks something like this. There's a planning, action, and post-planning phases. In the planning phase, you first have to identify what are your financial goals. You then got to do your homework and collect some information, analyze all the resources that are out there regarding money, and then decide on what to do. Then once you decide on what to do, you have to take action. So you've got to spend, you've got to invest, and you got to save. And then at some point, you have to begin evaluating to see if this was the right action to take. Now, controlling finances is one of the most important and practical aspects of management. And the best time is to start now. There needs to be flexibility in all financial plans. So even though you start now, your financial plan is going to look different years down the road. So why is it best to start now? Well, there's many reasons, but one is that every one of us needs an emergency fund. We talked about last class about the dangers of payday loans. If you begin saving now, you won't fall into the issue of having to secure a payday type loan. So what are the facts? Well, right now, about a quarter of Americans are not saving at all for retirement, which should be alarming to all of us. Of your generation, the millennial generation, about a third are not saving for retirement. And those that get older, such as myself, about half of them regret the decisions that they made, the financial decisions that they made when they were younger, such as not saving and spending every bit of their paycheck. So what should be considered when making a financial plan? Well, there's a lot of things you've got to consider. You've got to consider time. You've got to consider the amount of income you have versus the amount of debt that you have acquired. You've got to think about all of your financial responsibilities. You've also got to think about, do you have the ability to even take out loans or mortgages? And that really dictates, or that is dictated by your credit score, which we'll talk more about when I get back. Also, a financial plan is very much dependent upon where we are within the economy. If the economy is kind of shaky like it was back in 2008, then people are not spending as much money. They're saving more because they're a little bit more afraid of what's next. And you also have to think about all the different types of investments that are out there. We'll talk more a little bit later about the different instruments you have regarding saving and what degree of risk each one of those instruments has. The riskier the potential investment, the higher the potential reward. And so there's always a balance between those two things. So when you're making a financial plan, there's some things you got to consider. You've got to think about your goals. You've got to think about the intricacies of financial life, such as inflation and the time value of money, and what are the interest rates, and how much money could be invested. What are some of the liabilities and assets? What's your net worth? How long is this going to take? I mean, those are the type of things you've got to think about. You've also got to think about what are your day-to-day and your short-term and long-term needs. Also, you got to think about your career that you're going into, which we've kind of already talked about just a little bit, about how you may be going into a highly rewarding career, but it's a career that pays very little money. Well, that's going to dictate what your financial plan may look like. And then, of course, we got to think about the education. Right now, many of you, all of you, are trying to gain some type of education. Is that education going to pay off, and how much is it going to cost to obtain that education? And then one of the things that I'll talk at length about is going to be your plan for retirement. Not enough people are saving for retirement, and it's something that all of us eventually want. So if you think about this, here's a retirement scenario. Generally, the rule of thumb is that retirees should plan on tapping retirement saving to the tune of 4% annually, meaning that you will, out of all the money you have, you typically want to tap into about 4% of it each year. However, following that advice means that if you're retiring with $100,000 in retirement money, you're only going to be taking out $4,000 a year, which obviously is not enough money to live on. Now, if you combine that income with your typical Social Security income, which is about $1,300 per month that you will receive if you were a retiree in 2016, then you're only talking about $20,000 per year in income. For most of us, especially when we retire and we're older and we want to travel and do all kinds of fun stuff, $20,000 a year just really isn't going to cut it. So we've got to think about doing something more so that we can build up that nest egg, because $100,000 is, quite honestly, peanuts when it comes to retirement. And of course, the ultimate goal with all this financial planning and management is that you reach financial security. And so that's when you're able to meet all your day-to-day obligations while still being able to plan for the future, still being able to save, and still being able to invest to grow your wealth. And we'll talk more about the definition of wealth a little bit later, but that's the ultimate goal. And believe it or not, every one of you can assume some form of wealth. Now, there's some interesting psychology behind money and financial planning. Men and women tend to look at finances a little differently. Men typically are more focused on the money itself, the actual numbers, where women focus on how it affects them and their family. So I guess one scenario would be a male within the family, a husband, would be hyper-focused on how much interest they're earning and how much money they're saving each month. Whereas women would be just as focused on that, but also focused on, well, if we save too much, then it's going to affect the day-to-day life of the family. And you got to understand that I'm not denigrating either side. Both are critically important. And we have to always look at financial planning from a balanced perspective. You can save too much just as you can save too little. Now, there's some interesting things that we're going to talk a little bit more about later. But one of the main factors on if you save or not has to do with the economy. And so there's certain indicators of a successful or non-successful economy. Personal spending, so how much people are actually spending on a month-to-month basis. How many homes are being sold. There's a thing called the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of price changes when it comes to a sample of goods in a sample location at a sample time. So we're always looking to see how much things cost in relation to how much did they cost before. Also, an indicator of a strong or weak economy would be the unemployment rate. Obviously, a lower unemployment rate means a stronger economy. And then we also have the gross domestic product, which is the total amount of value, is the total market value of all goods and services produced by the U.S. during a specific period, usually 1 year. And so families are affected by changes in the economy. You know, one kind of real way we can look at how families are affected is when we look at inflation, which is typically measured through the Consumer Price Index. And if you notice here, we see that there is the average Consumer Price Index, if you go back from 1920 all the way to 2010 in this particular instance, and you can see that the Consumer Price Index has grown quite a bit, right? The change in it. And what that essentially means, and not to overcomplicate things, is that things cost more. And unfortunately, if you happen to be in a position where your wage is not changing each year, yet we're seeing Consumer Price Index change, then that means really you're making less money each year. And so that goes back to, when it comes to financial planning, the type of career you're going into. Is it a career with steady rising wages, or do they have stagnant wages? Because if they have stagnant wages, then each year it's going to be a little bit harder to live the same life you lived in the previous year. So there's some terminology, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we need to talk about it more face to face. But you have recessions, recoveries, and expansions within the economy. We've gone through a recession even within your lifetime, and then we've also gone through recovery, and we've gone through expansions. Now, there's some key terms that need to be defined, and we've talked about these a little bit. Inflation is rising prices. Consumer price index is a measure of inflation. Level of living is the goods and services affordable and available to the family. And then we have standard of living, what an individual or family aspires to. And then we have the GDP, which is the total value of all goods and services produced. Some more key terms that we're going to talk about in this session in the next few weeks here is discretionary income, and that's income regulated by one's own judgment. And then we have disposable income. That's the amount of take-home pay left after all deductions are made. Then we have the gross income, which is all the income received that's not legally exempt from taxes. And then we have a really interesting one called the psychic income, and that's one's perceptions or feelings about income. Then we have real income, which is the income measured in prices at a certain time, reflecting the buying power of current dollars. And so we'll talk more about these as the weeks progress. Now, one of the major topics when we talk about financial planning and finances are taxes. And so on average, 1/3 of the typical U.S. family's income goes to paying some form of tax, either at the federal, state, or local level. We also have income tax, and that's tax levied on how much money we bring in. And then another common term used within taxes is our net worth, and that's determined by subtracting what is owed, our liabilities, from what is owned, and that's our assets. And when we look at the net worth of Americans, we see that the net worth is not as much as we'd like to think it is. So you'll notice that in the blue, that is your net worth. And then in the red, that's your net worth excluding equity in your own home. So when you exempt the equity in your own home, you'll notice that, your age, less than 35 years, you have very little net worth. And then as you get older, obviously, hopefully you make more money and you acquire more assets, and you try to manage your liabilities, then you'll see that your net worth grows. However, when you take your home out of the equation, the net worth can be very, very stagnant. And so a home is a very important part of considering your net worth. I wanted to kind of show you this because some people say all kinds of things about taxes and where their money goes. And so at the federal level, this is a breakdown of someone that makes $25,000 a year. They don't have any kids, and so what that means is about 14% of their money goes to the federal government of their income. And so what you see here is that Social Security, you'll invest about $1,500 into Social Security if you're making $25,000 a year. You'll also put in about $363 in Medicare. And then with your income tax, what this particular website did is it broke down the total income tax payment into the different major categories. So one of the biggest categories is national defense. So that's where a big chunk of your federal income tax goes towards, is supporting military personnel salaries and benefits and ongoing research and operations and essentially wars. And then healthcare is another big cost. And so you see that Medicaid and children's health insurance programs, $181 a year is what you would personally contribute out of your $25,000. And then if you look down at job, family, and security, that's another $315 total dollars out of your $25,000 for 1 year. And you can see that food and nutrition assistance. So many times this is considered to be food stamps, could be. Food and nutrition assistance is $65. Housing assistance is $29. I guess what I'm getting at is some of these things that we complain about as far as, well, where is my money going? As you can see, it's very little compared to where some of your money's going regarding defense and healthcare. If you look here at education, sadly enough, only about 47 of your dollars go towards education at the federal level. You look here at veteran benefits, only about $91 for income and housing and support and health care and training of our veterans. And then the natural resources, so water and land management, about $12. International affairs, I know we spend a lot of time, at least in the news, talking about how much money we send over for humanitarian assistance. Well, if you're making $25,000, it's $15. And then, of course, the super expensive NASA space program. Well, at $25,000 a year, you're paying about $10 for that. So I think it's kind of interesting to show actually where your money is going. So I thought I'd just point that out since we're talking about money and budgeting and planning. When it comes to budgeting, you have to have a spending plan, and there's really two types of expenses. There's variable and there's fixed expenses. People in the U.S. save an average of 4% of their income, which is lower than most industrialized nations. 4% is definitely not enough. I know currently I'm saving about 15% of my income for retirement and other emergency funds and rainy day funds. And the ultimate goal is to have an emergency fund that will sustain you for 3 to 6 months. And so a question I ask is do you have that? More than likely you don't. So how much do you have currently saved? And how much do you plan to save for retirement? And when do you plan on starting to save for retirement? These are some of the questions I'm going to be asking you in that email, and I'm going to send out with a link to this. And I want you to answer these. And so hopefully this presentation has kind of helped frame the conversation and introduce the topic of finances to you. And obviously in the next few weeks, we're going to talk more and more about it. So good luck, and I look forward to seeing your submissions.